Last week, we took a deep dive into tainted groundwater in eastern Oregon and the state's stunning lack of action towards stopping the pollution. Tonight, we're going to talk more about groundwater. And if you live outside of Oregon, hold on, stay with us. It still applies to you. Groundwater is the stuff that's underground, everything besides oceans and lakes and rivers. People with wells tap into that groundwater. And in many parts of Oregon, the groundwater is polluted. It's contaminated. It's not safe to drink. The tricky thing is, if you drink from a well that taps into a relatively young aquifer, that's what the water under the ground is called, it may taste great, even though it's contaminated. I'm telling you that because I got an email last week after our reports from someone who used to be inside the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and he's still very concerned about groundwater. He thinks thousands of you who use wells are drinking polluted water and don't know it. Greg Pettit is the person who sent me that email. He's retired now, but he worked nearly 4 decades for the Oregon DEQ. His job included manager of the Water Quality Monitoring Section and later administrator of the Laboratory Environmental Assessment Division.
I think that the awareness of the problem is very limited, and that's part of the problem. People simply not aware that this is a problem.
Is that why you're stepping forward?
Well, it's been a passion of mine ever since I found contamination back in the mid-80s, that it's just not getting the attention it deserves to protect people's health. And so I'm always willing to step up and say what I know about the issue. Probably nobody in the state has a longer history with this problem that's around than I do right now, so hopefully we don't have to repeat lessons that were learned years ago.
Pettit there is arguably the guy responsible for Oregon's Groundwater Quality Protection Act, which passed back in 1989. In 1985, he applied for an EPA grant and used the money to test private wells across Oregon.
So when we did the initial survey in 1985, we sampled 380 wells statewide, and we found extensive contamination the worst areas we found were in the lower Umatilla Basin, which you've done the story about, in the Malheur Basin around Ontario, and in the Willamette Valley.
He said there was other parts of the state that were contaminated as well. And the new state law grew from that. It requires the state to protect groundwater, and when contamination is found, the law requires the state to put rules in place to clean it up. But as we saw in the lower Umatilla Basin, that is not happening. The reason, according to Pettit, politics. Most of the pollution comes from the farming industry, and they are very good at pushing back.
The political pressure of the ag lobby in this state and the lack of very specific regulatory drivers to do something, between those two things, nobody's been willing to stick their neck out there and take that issue on directly. And I know that I worked a little bit with Leah Feldon, the new director at the DEQ laboratory, and I know she is very concerned about environmental justice issues. And this groundwater contamination problem, to me, is the most documentable environmental justice issues in the state. Because for the most part, people that are being exposed to these contaminants in their groundwater are people that don't have power. They have a limited voice in the community. And even within their communities that are dominated by agricultural industry, it's not a comfortable position to get out and start complaining about agriculture. You know, you can see the position it puts in them. So there's very little, for the people that are being affected, there's a lot of things that make it very hard for them to get the problem changed.
By the way, he meant to say that Leah Feldon is the director of the DEQ, which she now is. So the people most impacted have little political power, and the farm lobby is very powerful and very good at pushing back politically. On top of that, he said there are no specific laws that focus on testing wells after they're put in place. Again, that means if you drink well water anywhere in Oregon, you may have contaminated water and you just don't realize it.
There are about at least 700,000 people in Oregon who get their water from private wells. And there is no program currently in place to ensure that those people are not being exposed to contaminants that could endanger their health.
There's no regulations?
There's no regulations. The Safe Drinking Water Act, which is a federal act, only covers public water supplies. And so these private well owners are mainly on their own. Now, DEQ and Oregon Health Authority, they recommend, and if you go to their website, they'll say you should have your well tested, and these are the things you should have it tested for and whatnot. But based upon your story and based upon my experience, especially when you get outside Lub, which is a lower Umatilla Basin, which is an area where the groundwater problems are fairly well known, but you get in other areas of the state and people think if this water tastes and looks and smells great, it's good water. So I'm sure that definitely there are thousands, probably tens of thousands of people in this state drinking water from wells that have contaminants in them.
I think that's a stunning thing to say. But he said it has not been a primary concern or a priority at the DEQ. Instead, through the years, Pettit says DEQ moved money away from groundwater issues. It lost its urgency in a blizzard of other priorities and federal programs that the DEQ carries out or monitors. Now, he said, it is time to return to a focus to groundwater and all those people drinking from wells statewide. And he says the way to protect it? Mandatory rules to restrict farmers and others from polluting the aquifer below the ground.
You know, I'm just being perfectly honest with you here, Pat. If you look at the great environmental improvements in water quality, in air quality, in reducing hazardous waste sites around the state and the nation, there's tons of data. I have a PowerPoint presentation I could show you. There's tons of data that shows that specific regulatory programs, when implemented, made drastic improvements in our environmental quality. We certainly want to encourage voluntary efforts to improve the environment. But if you look at what has worked historically for the last 50 years, when there have been major new requirements through one of these federal acts implemented, we can measure fairly drastic improvements in air and water quality. And I'm talking about like 1/10 the contamination that was there before.
And when you say major new requirements, you mean mandatory?
I mean mandatory, exactly. I'm talking about mandatory. These programs, the federal acts, were pretty much all mandatory when they were enacted.
By the way, we've asked for interviews with the regional director of the EPA and also the state director of the DEQ. We look forward to bringing those to you one of these days soon. So he's saying there that there should be mandatory new rules that limit the contamination of groundwater and protect the 700,000 people drinking well water in Oregon. We're going to be exploring this issue quite a bit in the coming year. In the meantime, I hope you'll take a few moments to watch our series of reports from Eastern Oregon. It's called Tainted Waters. It's posted now on our KGW YouTube channel. We also have a documentary version of the report, which you can also find on our YouTube channel or our streaming app on Roku and Amazon Fire. It's called KGW Plus.